My next guest was a key witness in Donald Trump's first impeachment trial, testifying about Trump's pressure campaign to get Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. Retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman joins me now. He's the author of the book Here, Right Matters, An American Story. Great book, very successful book. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, thanks so much for being with us. The very thing that you said during Trump's first impeachment, he did again after his 2020 loss. Instead of pressuring Ukraine, he was pressuring the Department of Justice. He was pressuring election officials in places like Georgia. Both times he faced no legal or political consequences. And as we were just talking about with Ellie a few moments ago, there's all this hesitancy and trepidation, I suppose, to haul him in front of the January 6th committee. It seems like this works out for him every time. At some point, Colonel Vindman, doesn't somebody just have to stand up to him? You know all about that.
Well, absolutely. And I think individual actors have and maybe have suffered some of the consequences, but they've served the U.S., the general public good. I think what ends up happening is if Trump and his cronies are not held accountable, this becomes a rehearsal for a future insurrection. We need accountability to deal with the crimes, the criminal activity from the previous administration, to be able to expose the big lie of stolen elections, to expose the president's wrongdoing, to expose the corruption of his proxies. And if we do that, we could start chipping away at the big lie. We could start bringing this country back together, and with that, move ahead. Without accountability, we can't do that.
Yeah. And I think people at home see how Trump's allies are trying to stonewall these proceedings. They see Steve Bannon doing it right now. They wonder, what is the point of this process if it's so easy to get around it? I mean, what's the point of issuing subpoenas? Why do these congressional subpoenas exist if you can just toss them by the wayside and ignore them? Do you think our institutions are built to withstand these types of tactics?
I don't think so. And I think in part what we've experienced the past 4 years, and maybe even longer, is that the legislative branch has ceded some of its authority. It's ceded its role as a check on executive power. And I think that this is an opportunity for the legislative branch to assert its role in the constitutional process, hold the former president and other officials accountable, that is both through the subpoenas and through an exposure of what happened, bring the facts out into the light about January 6th. The other thing is, in reality, this is also a political endeavor. And it exposes that this president, this former president, President Trump, was a corrupt actor that continues to try to steal the election that he lost, which is pretty amazing. Now now it's also in the hands of the American public. We have an election in less than a few weeks. And what I think we need to do is we need to take a look at those people that the president supports, those Trump acolytes, those other actors that have proven themselves to be compromised. Actually, they've marked themselves with the scarlet letter of President Trump's approval, and we need to make sure that those folks do not make it into into office. And that's why one of the reasons I've supported Terry McAuliffe against Glenn Youngkin. Glenn Youngkin is a Trump acolyte. He supports the former president's policies with regards to denying the severity of COVID, denying January 6th insurrection, denying propagating this idea of a stolen election, and we can't have that. He's actually in the state of Virginia. He's a non-viable candidate. It's just a matter of the population showing up and making their voices heard.
I do want to ask you a little bit about that in just a moment, but just to button this up on January 6th, if you were advising the January 6th committee, would you advise the committee to issue a subpoena for Donald Trump to testify, cooperate with that investigation?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And now I have the privilege of doing that because I'm not an attorney and don't have to understand all the difficulties there. But on the same note, the president should be brought to justice. He's not above the law. I felt that was the case when I reported presidential wrongdoing and presidential abuse of power. And if he lies in front of the commission, then he should suffer the consequences. The problem is that he has not suffered the consequences. He did not suffer the consequences of an abuse of power in the first impeachment that led him to believe that he could act with impunity, mismanage COVID, attempt to steal an election into the future. And also in the second, and after the insurrection, he was not held accountable. What discourages him from continuing to behave as a future authoritarian leader attempting to entice Republican state governments from introducing legislation that allows them to overturn the will of the people that vote in one direction. We need accountability. It's an open wound. Without accountability, you can't move forward.
And I know you're a Terry McAuliffe supporter, so let me ask you about this Virginia race, which is becoming a national race. There's just no question about it. I want to go to an event that happened last week. You probably noticed this. It was a rally for Glenn Youngkin, the Republican candidate who's challenging Terry McAuliffe. And at that event, they pledged allegiance to an American flag that they claimed was used or carried during the January 6th insurrection. What was your response when you saw that?
He's disqualified. He's an extremist. He has no place leading the Commonwealth of Virginia. In fact, he's certainly not the best suited to lead the Commonwealth of Virginia. We have a former governor that's running for another term. He's ready to govern on day one. He's ready to advance the interests of the Commonwealth, the population of the Commonwealth of Virginia. He's ready to make sure that we continue to move in the right direction with regards to law enforcement, like he did under his first tenure, with regards to economic prosperity. The only people that Youngkin has served so far are himself.
Why do you think the race is so close right now? Why does Terry McAuliffe need Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Mrs. Biden? Why does he need all of these high-flying surrogates, folks like yourself, out there campaigning on his behalf, if it's such an open and shut case as you're saying?
I think what he's preying on fears, and we know that fears are a much bigger motivator than the hopes and beliefs in prosperity. His slogans about, critical race theory, which is there's no substance to it. Critical race theory is not being taught in school. It's about mask mandates and that undermining the validity of the impact of COVID on the Commonwealth of Virginia, on law enforcement, where he has no executive experience and is not prepared to govern the way Terry McAuliffe is. But he's still preying on, these are the typical slogans that we heard out of President Trump, out of other acolytes, and that's what he's preying on.
And do you think that if Youngkin wins this race, that this starts to pave the way, starts to clear the path for Donald Trump to run for another term in office? What worries you about that?
Absolutely. I think this is a bellwether. I think just the way we considered the recall in California a bellwether, if Larry Elder had won that one, then we would be talking about probably a different set of circumstances, a different environment. But this is another critical moment. If a Trump acolyte wins in Virginia, a purple state that's moving in the direction of progressive, moving in the direction of, frankly, progress, not progressive, just in terms of progress, being more inclusive, more representative, and there's a reversal there, I think that sets a template. I think we need to defeat Glenn Youngkin because he is a Trump supporter. He represents Trump's policies. He's not prepared to govern. Terry McAuliffe is. That's who I encourage people to vote for.
All right, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, thanks so much. We appreciate it. Thanks for stopping by, and please do that again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.